do whatever he tells you. You know, we're reading now from the Gospel of John, and it's very different than the other Gospels. It's kind of its own genre, if you would, with layers and layers of sort of meaning and double meaning in it. And this very first reading we hear today, this Gospel reading, it's the first of the signs that they call signs. So there's only 7 miracles in John's Gospel in total, but they aren't even called miracles, they're called signs. And of course, what they're pointing to is some aspect or attribute of God. And so every time we hear a sign, we have to say, well, what is the evangelist trying to communicate? And this, here, there's layers of meaning here, and we've got to sort of pull back the covers a little bit to find out. So wine, if you ran out of wine, it was considered a social faux pas, right? That was not a thing. So you would generally have lots of cheap wine, right? So just when people, oh yeah, just go ahead, have more. Now, what Jesus does, he turns around, and wine was a symbol of joy, right? So that's in Old Testament times and in ancient times. Now, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out why, right? That's okay. A little bit of wine, oh, yeah, everything's fine. So that's it. So wine is meant to equal to joy. And so what happens here is that he takes 6 stone jars, now 20, 30 gallons, just to kind of give you a comprehension of how much wine we're talking about. He produced 600 to 800 bottles of wine. That's a lot of joy. I don't know how many people there's at that. Even if you had like 300 or 100 people, that was 2 extra bottles per person for the evening. That's a lot of wine. So what the evangelist is trying to communicate here is an abundance of joy that comes from God's grace. That God's kingdom is overflowing with good joy. And so that's what we're left with, is that this is the first aspect that John communicates, is that the purpose of life is joy. Purpose of life is joy, that we are called to be joy-filled in our life. Now look, let's face it, we might know that intellectually, but in practice, that's kind of hard to always hold on to, because life has a way of coming at us, and it doesn't always feel so, well, joyful. There's a lot of things that happen, whether it happens to us or happens to someone else whom we love, that kind of, in a say, sort of steals our joy away. What steals our joy is a good question to ask ourselves. But here's what's important. Just let's say focus on attaining joy. Then the question is, how do we attain joy? How do we reach that? How do we sort of curate joy in our life? Well, what we'll go on to hear from John's Gospel is it's about being open to God's grace. That we have to be open to God's grace first, and then we have to leave space for it. Right? We have to leave space for God's grace in our life so that we can then receive the joy. Now, the real answer today is from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. See, Paul's letter to Corinthians, we have to understand this part of it's just before it talks about all the different gifts that people give. It says, well, you got this gift, you got that gift, you got this gift, and you got that gift. All those gifts are great. But he then goes on, well, we didn't read the next section, which we'll read next week, is that, and the greatest of all these gifts is love. That's the next. We're familiar with that portion of Corinthians, is all about love. Love is patient, love is kind, love is, so that's what we're going to hear. Paul is saying, look, you can have all the gifts in the world, and if you don't use them lovingly, then it will not produce any joy. It will not give you what you're not using it for its intended purposes. So he's talking about all that. In the end, what we're called to do is love one another. And that's where joy comes. Now, years ago there was a phrase I always loved. My father and my mother used to use it all the time. A sorrow shared is half the sorrow. A joy shared is twice the joy. It's an old phrase. Now they actually have science that says that's actually true. That the brain and the heart, that once we share a joy or a happiness, it's the happiness studies, right? Once we share a happiness, it actually gets magnified. If we share a loss or a sorrow, it gets diminished. So they've actually connected that's physiologically in the brain, it actually decreases the suffering or increases the actual happiness. Now, why do I bring that up? It's because we're called to do it in community. We're called to build this joy. We can't, in other words, we can't successfully do it without community. Because here's how it works: is that if I am joyful if I do something that's good for myself, but if you, whom I love, have something that makes you joyful, I actually get a bigger rise out of that, more joy out of seeing you joyful than I would for myself. And I think we all know that instinctively. That when things go, then our family, when our children succeed in doing something, we're delighted more than as if it was for ourselves. When our grandchildren do something that's enlightening or just wonderful, we get so much more joy out of it than as if we had just done it ourselves. See, this is how joy works. Now look, last night, for example, we had a volunteer reception for all the people in our parish that volunteer in different capacities. And you could feel the joy palpable in that room last night, over in the person. People were delighted to serve one another. They get joy from sharing with one another. And that's what we're trying to celebrate. And we're trying to recognize, and that's what I'm trying to communicate to you, is that if you really want to be joyful, then you got to serve somebody else. It's about giving yourself away. Now, you've heard me mention this book, a book called The Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I want to reflect on one more aspect of it because it highlights this very thing. There's 4 virtues or 4 pillars for the joy for the mind and 4 for the heart. The 4 for the mind we've done before, but the 4 for the heart are these: is forgiveness, gratitude, generosity, and I'm going to remember the last one in a second now. I'll come to me. But compassion. So it actually is compassion and generosity. But these last 3 actually come together: gratitude, compassion, and generosity. Because here's the way it works, and they highlight it well, and so does Pope Francis, is that when we share out of when we realize how grateful we are. When we're grateful for what we have, then we're willing to share what we have with others. And that's called compassion, right? We're sharing it. And then we're generous. And when we're generous, then completes that flywheel of joy in our life, that we celebrate with others, and then we give ourselves away. So in summary today, if we want to partake of the wine of life, the joy of life, we're called to serve one another. We're called to give ourselves away. And the promise is that the grace in our life will be so abundant, it will be overflowing. Once we do this, we'll give it away, and other people will be joyful because of it. So today, as we come to the table to receive the grace of God in this Eucharist, we come to share in it, but also come to give it away, to give that joy away by serving others in our life so that we can continue this life of joy.